Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flack.
The Lord is my strength and shield. I trust him with all my heart. He helps me, and my heart is filled with joy. Well, that is Psalm 28, verse 7, and I am your host, Sandra Flack. Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. I am so grateful to be with you today and excited because we have back with us our favorite doctor guest, Dr. Jerrod Brown. We're going to dive into an important topic with Dr. Brown today, but first, please listen to this message about an important resource that we have for you.
Sandra Flack, host of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, and FASD educator Debbie Raymond, invite you to join Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, diagnosed or not. This faith-based support community meets online 3 times each month, features special VIP guests, and a private Facebook group for members only, which includes Soul Care Saturday video devotionals led by Sandra and Deb. Both Sandra and Deb are adoptive moms raising kids with FASD and facilitators of the Facets neurobehavioral model. For details and to register, visit justicefororphansny.org/hope-community. That's justicefororphansny.org/hope-community.
So if you're new to this podcast, I always like to kind of just talk a little bit at the beginning because you hear that commercial about our FASD support group. And like I said, if you're new here, you might not understand the relevance of why adoptive and foster parents may need a support group specifically for parents caring for kids with prenatal exposure. And that is because most people don't realize that prenatal exposure to alcohol is the leading cause of developmental and learning disabilities worldwide. Yes, worldwide. 1 in 20 school-age kids in the United States has been prenatally exposed to alcohol, so it's more prevalent than autism. And 86% of children in child welfare have an FASD. So think foster, adoptive, and kinship. Most are undiagnosed or misdiagnosed with a whole alphabet soup of other diagnoses: ADHD, ADD, ASD, PTSD, ODD. You get the picture, right? And while those diagnoses, they may be accurate, but most likely they all come under the umbrella of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. One of my kiddos actually in the past year was diagnosed with an intellectual disability. He's always also had a diagnosis of ADHD since the time he was 6, when he also got diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. But the only reason why there's, ADHD and intellectual disability is because of the prenatal exposure. So I'm a mom of a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old with FAS. And I spent years trying to figure out if, those big behaviors that we were dealing with, was it trauma? Was it because of the FAS? Because back when they got diagnosed, they got diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome, and we were handed a pamphlet on ADHD. And the only thing I found online way, way back then was really dark and hopeless outcomes for our kids, which it does not have to be. So we became trauma informed because there wasn't a whole lot out there back then about FASD other than scary stuff. And, doing the connected parenting strategies definitely worked. I highly recommend. I always recommend everybody on this journey reads The Connected Child, The Connected Parent, TBRI, get trauma informed, get those tools, in your toolbox. But if there was prenatal exposure, you will reach a point, usually maybe when they're teenagers, when, the train's coming off the tracks, maybe you have connection, maybe you have, attachment down, but there's still something, what is going on, right? And it's highly likely that it's an FASD. So I offer not only the support group that you just heard about, I also offer one-on-one FASD coaching for parents and caregivers online and in-person training. So FASD workshops. So, you can check out all of those resources on our website. Every month, I offer at least one free intro to FASD online workshop. And then I've got other ones that are more in-depth and take longer. But in all of them, not only do we unpack the impact of prenatal exposure and the symptoms and how to take a brain-based approach to parenting and really provide you with the tools to help your kids. So, I've been in other workshops where, you'll learn about what FASD is, but you don't really walk out with the strategies that parents are desperate for. Like, we need some tools, we need some help. What do we do? I can help you with that, because not only do I have professional training, I have years of lived experience and still on the journey, because our 19 and 21-year-olds still live at home. So been doing this for a long time and now want to offer you resources that I didn't have in those early days. So if you want to learn about any more of that, go to our website, justicefororphans.ny.org. Click the training tab at the top of the page. You'll see FASD in the drop down, and then click there and you'll be able to access all of those resources and find out more there. I also would love it for you to, if you would check out my personal website, sandraflack.com, because there I have written many blogs on FASD. So you can, if you would like to read blogs, you can go there and get a lot more information as well, and follow our social media, and follow this podcast. So this podcast not only is available on all your podcast platforms, but it is also, you can find the videos of this podcast on YouTube at the Justice for Orphans YouTube channel. So I invite you to check that out, and please subscribe, like, follow, leave a review, do all the things. Would greatly appreciate that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Now to our guest. Dr. Jerrod Brown is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod has also provided consultation services to a number of caregivers, professionals, and organizations pertaining to topics related to autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility, trauma and other life adversities, traumatic brain injury, and youth fire setting. Jerrod has completed four separate master's degree programs and holds graduate certificates in neuropsychology, autism spectrum disorder, other health disabilities, and traumatic brain injuries. In 2021, Jerrod completed a post-doctoral certificate in leadership and organizational strategy and a professional certificate in forensic psychology. Jerrod has published several articles and book chapters, and is also regularly featured on several national and international podcasts, including this one. So please, please welcome back Dr. Jerrod Brown. Hey, Jerrod.
Sandra, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. It's always a pleasure to have you back on the show. You're such a wealth of information to our families. And I can't wait to dive into the topic today, which is, I believe, so relevant: FASD and addictive behaviors. So let's get right to it. Is it true that people who were exposed to alcohol in the womb are more vulnerable to addictive behaviors? And if that's the case, why is that so?
Yeah, the research says yes. And we probably all heard the stats, like anywhere from like 90 to 99% of folks with FASD have a co-occurring mental health issue.
Yeah.
There is some statistics out there that have found that folks with FASD might be as many as 20 times more likely to be dealing with substance use related issues compared to the general population. There's other older statistics out there, but in all the consultation work have done over the years, nearly all of the clients have some sort of maybe addictive tendencies. I'm not saying it's always going to be drugs or alcohol, but if you open that up to sugar, caffeine, tobacco, just other kinds of maybe unhealthy foods and even screen time, that number grows. So the FASD brain, why might it be more vulnerable to addictive tendencies? Well, start with executive function and metacognition and self-control. All of those are kind of interconnected. But you're going to find plenty of research too, unfortunately, when someone at FASD doesn't have the proper supports, services, interventions in place, and we know most people with FASD have never received an accurate diagnosis. They're at greater likelihood to be dealing with externalizing behavioral problems. They deal with a lot of internalizing problems that could be like anxiety and depression, but externalizing problems is how they're going to show different behavioral mannerisms to the world. So that's going to be easy for you and I to see. Externalizing problems, getting into trouble with law enforcement, defiance, rule following problems, lying, cheating, stealing, mood swings. These are all externalizing problems that are found in this literature. But substance use is also an externalizing problem, but it can also cause all kinds of internalizing distress and all kinds of other things. What I see in the work I do when it comes to substance use, and I've worked with many, many clients, not with FASD, who have like serious mental health issues and co-occurring substance use, always look through a trauma lens. More times than not, there's probably going to be some trauma, never 100%. Most of the time, there's going to be attachment issues, especially if we're talking FASD, because 60-70% of people with FASD have attachment issues, the research says. And that's just not from trauma after birth. It's because of the in utero exposure to alcohol, where it actually damaged parts of their brain on a neurophysiological, neurocognitive level. It has impacted their attachment patterns. If you're interested in that topic, just Google FASD and oxytocin production, and you'll find stuff on that. So look at it through trauma, attachment, executive function lens. And practically speaking, let's say it's a teenager or an adult with FASD, and they start getting into drugs or alcohol or any kind of other like behavioral addictions, pornography, screen time. I mean, the list goes on. There's a million variables, but one of them, disinhibited behaviors. So we talked about this on lots of other podcasts we've done, but basically, if someone has disinhibited behaviors, that parking brake in their brain or that pause button is not working properly. So practically speaking, that comes out as being very impatient, lacking restraint, having a hard time sitting still. It looks like a lot of fidgeting or just lots of movement, mannerisms, things like that. So if that person has the reduced ability to inhibit inappropriate thoughts, behaviors, emotions, that is a recipe for substance misuse in some cases, depending on access. Do they have access to drugs and alcohol? What's the modeling been like in their home growing up? We know a lot of children, unfortunately with FASD, are not raised by birth parents. So when were they removed from their birth home? Were they removed at an age where they have a lot of memory of dysfunction? Or were they removed right at birth? I mean, there's all kinds of variables here. But disinhibited behavior, as that person gets older, maybe as an infant or child, it's going to come out as high levels of colickiness, sleep-related issues, feeding problems. As that child gets a little bit older, maybe gets into kindergarten, it's going to probably look like ADHD and oppositional behavior, and the teachers are going to be confused and maybe calling the parents a lot. Well, your child's not paying attention. They're disrupting all kinds of people. As that child gets a little older in the school system, unfortunately, I see this all the time. They may get labeled as the bad kid. They may be thrusted into special education. They start getting bullied and teased. They're not turning homework in on time. As they become teenagers, then a lot of the students may pull away from that individual, and then that individual starts associating maybe with people that maybe don't have their best intentions in mind, and now they're exposed to, maybe it's tobacco starting out. As they get a little bit older, now they're exposed to alcohol or marijuana or drugs, and then that can spiral out of control. I mean, that's one example of
Yeah.
many, but disinhibited behaviors are a big variable to take into account. I'll kick it back to you, my friend, but I have a lot more we can go into the weeds on.
Yeah. Well, that my brain is spinning because so much of what you said made me think of some other questions that I wasn't even really thinking of. So, a couple of things, because you were talking about, trauma and attachment issues, and so many of our kids, kids coming into, if they're in an adoptive placement, kinship, foster care, they've all experienced some level of trauma already. And
Yeah.
a lot of them do struggle with attachment issues because, especially kids in foster care who are bounced from place to place to place to place, or like in the case of my boys, they were, the first several years of their lives, they were in an institution. So we've already got that, like that's kind of a given almost, right? You're going to have some level of trauma, and then we add on to that, layer on to that. Many of them have been prenatally exposed to alcohol. So it's like these kids are even more prone, I think, to addictive behaviors.
And the issue of gullibility and suggestibility also need to be taken into account,
Yeah.
where maybe they're growing up in a home with a parent who has good intentions, but they're not connecting the dots that all kids are observing and soaking in things. But for a child, teenager with FASD who's extremely going to be probably gullible or naive or suggestible, what happens if that parent smokes cigarettes, or that parent seems to like the energy drinks or the sugar sweetened
Right.
beverages or the alcohol beverages, and that child starts experimenting and so on. So suggestibility, modeling behavior, we need to be really aware of that with all children, but especially someone who has FASD. Just looking at, let's just say substance use in general. What are some of the serious complications that can result regardless of individual? Again, I've worked with folks, most adults, that have all kinds of different diagnoses, and some of them have been using, unfortunately, drugs and alcohol for longer than I've been alive. But liver disease can be increased, cardiovascular issues, diabetes, even poor wound healing or compromised immune system functioning. So these are going to be folks that have really severe substance use issues over a long, long period of time. If you look specifically at the adolescent substance use literature, and this isn't FASD specific, but again, know that folks with FASD are going to have more issues with drugs and alcohol problems compared to the general population. So if an adolescent uses drugs and alcohol, what are some of the consequences? We all know it, but increased risk of overdose. We hear stories like that all the time. Fentanyl, all that. That's scary stuff.
Yeah.
What happens if that adolescent gets a driver's license, crashes, increased risk of getting in car accidents, things like that? The adolescent brain is developing, so if you start introducing drugs and alcohol in the equation, think of the cognitive impairment that can cause. And we know that folks with FASD already have the cognitive issues. So you introduce drugs and alcohol in that equation, it's just amplifying it and making it way, way worse. suicide risk goes up without a doubt. You look at substance use is a factor amongst other things. Sexually transmitted diseases, that adolescents using drugs and alcohol, and they already have a compromised brain, and that impulse control is through the roof, and they're not connecting the dots. They may, unfortunately, have sex with people and unprotected sex and unwanted pregnancies and STDs. I mean, I've consulted on all kinds of cases about these kinds of things. So those are some of the things to be aware of. I mean, it's kind of scary, but it is the
Yeah.
reality of it. Energy drink consumption. I think we did a podcast on that, if I remember right.
Yep.
Maybe I'm confabulating. I don't know, but
Sugar. We did definitely sugar sweetened beverages, things like that. We did do a whole episode on that.
if we haven't done one on energy drinks, I'd encourage us to do one on that, because
Yeah.
that's a whole nother can of worms with this. And I've actually given some talks on this, and you're going to find plenty of research studies that talk about kids who seem to have almost a habit like forming behaviors with energy drinks are much more likely to experiment with alcohol,
Mm.
cigarettes, e-cigarettes, cannabis, and other drugs. So that might be an early intervention, prevention kind of strategy. If you know that adolescent really likes the energy drinks, do everything you can to get them off that. Energy drinks serve very little purpose to human health. You can see like some are
Mhm.
marketed for increased energy, or it's going to help your thinking. They're
Mhm.
not good for you. They're not at all. Sexual risk taking goes up with energy drink consumption, getting into fights, the list goes on. It's really scary stuff. We've talked about food insecurity too. There's some really interesting research to show that kids, adults, teenagers who are dealing with food insecurity may be at much greater likelihood to be dealing with substance use problems. And substance use problems may be more likely to contribute to food insecurity. The question is, why is that the case? Because if someone has an addictive tendency, are they going to spend money on that addiction, or are they going to spend money on food? The research
Mhm.
says they're much more likely to spend it on their alcohol, their drugs, their tobacco. And now at
Yeah.
the end of the day, they don't have enough money for food. And if you're not getting the right kinds of food, you're not fueling your brain, your hormones are off. We've talked about this too. And your gut's off, you got inflammation going on. That can just further exacerbate the drive to seek out drugs. And for kids and adults with FASD, they may not have that good ability to self-soothe, and they have all this distress coming out. They don't know how to cope with it. So what happens? They found a coping skill that works. Alcohol and drugs do work in
Mhm.
the very short term. Terrible coping skill,
Yeah.
but it is effective in the short term. And then over time, it obviously explodes in terms of all kinds of other negative health outcomes.
Yeah, I was actually, that was going to be a question I was going to ask, because I was thinking about kids with FASD, people with FASD. There's the primary symptoms, and we know when they're not well supported or accommodated, it can lead to secondary symptoms, which, using alcohol and drugs and things can be secondary, tertiary, when it comes to addiction. But I'm seeing like anxiety, depression, things like that are secondary symptoms. And then alcohol and drug use and addiction is tertiary. So I'm seeing, and I've observed teenagers who, we understand that they have an FASD. Maybe the school system doesn't understand. It's a very, stress-filled, school is stressful, causes a lot of anxiety and stress. So we're seeing kids who are vaping or reaching for marijuana to kind of, you know, that's how they're dealing with the stress and the anxiety that's really brought on by not being understood or accommodated appropriately. So that's another aspect of this, really.
Yeah, you throw social media in there too.
Yeah.
How impressionable kids are,
Yeah.
gaming, all of those things, loneliness. If that child, teenager doesn't have a lot of friends, and unfortunately, we know
Mhm.
FASD, social cognition
Yeah.
impairments, which are theory of mind deficits, mentalization, problems, empathy-related concerns in some cases, which can trickle down into interpersonal competence, working as a team, finding good, healthy friends. Those are all barriers. There's unfortunately very clear in the research literature. Alexithymia, you and I have done a podcast on that.
Yes.
That is a risk factor for drug and alcohol use in general, because people with alexithymia are much more likely to turn to problematic coping strategies. If your audience isn't familiar with that term, if they haven't seen that episode, it's emotional blindness. It's when someone has a hard time naming, labeling, and processing emotions. So there's a big emotional block. Those emotions have to go somewhere. So they go back into the body. Headaches, chest pains, stomach aches, anxiety, panic attacks, things like that. So the research shows people with true alexithymia probably going to be more likely to have avoidant coping strategies. So maybe lacking assertiveness, probably having less internal locus of control and more external locus of control, lower levels of self-efficacy, and they're much more likely to be dealing with like maladaptive emotional dysregulation strategies. And over time, that person may pick up bad habits, stress eating, caffeine, sugar, smoking, drugs, alcohol, and so on. And there's so many things we could talk about, but we know too that a high percentage of people with FASD also look like or have ADHD. And if you look at the ADHD literature, you're going to find tons of studies that talk about having undiagnosed ADHD or untreated increases the risk of all kinds of things, including substance misuse and so on. So the list goes on and on and on. Substance misuse is a health compromising behavior. There's one of many. I can go into detail on the other ones if that's helpful.
Yeah, I was also thinking with the most kiddos with FASD have an ADHD diagnosis as well. So can you talk about when it comes to medication for ADHD, I have heard that if an individual with FASD is taking those medications, it can actually exacerbate the FASD symptoms because why? Like, can you speak to that?
Probably going to hold off on the medication piece because I'm not a psychiatrist. Talk to the psychiatrist on that.
Okay.
But there is research out there that talks about that. But every brain is so different. So talk to your healthcare provider about the medication. I'm sorry, Sandra. I'd love to talk about that, but probably shouldn't.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a doctor either, and I don't have a PhD or several or a master's, or what you have, but I wanted to bring that up because I get asked that a lot. Perseveration is very common, with people with FASD. They get super, focused, on a topic or on something. And I have to think that if an individual is prone to perseveration, it's going to also lead to, the drug addiction piece, right?
It sure could. It sure could. Rumination, perseveration, compulsive behaviors, those are elements that can make someone more prone. Practically speaking, what do you do about that? Go for a walk. Look at the walking literature. It's really just common sense stuff. Deep breathing, journaling, drawing. Those are things that can be very helpful with that. Working with a competent therapist, counselor, working with a skills worker. Sleep issues is like pouring fuel on this fire too. People who are chronically sleep deprived might be way more likely to have perseverative thinking and rumination and racing thoughts. So treat the underlying sleep issue, and that calms the brain and body down. What we eat has a lot to do with that. Because so if we're just pounding down again the sugar sweetened beverages and we're skipping breakfast every day, and at lunch you're going through the drive-through and ordering things that are not good for the body. Your hormones are out of whack, your gut's off, which then impacts your brain and your thinking. So taking a holistic look at this, eat better, move more, sleep better. I mean, those are all common sense things that we can all do better with. And the FASD brain is so vulnerable to different kinds of insults. So calming that brain down with good nutrition, good sleep, exercise, while doing it in conjunction with healthy, positive people, that can make a world of difference in helping that person's brain just kind of slow down, make better sense of things. And then when you're trying to teach a skill or whatever you're doing, while you're doing that, go on a walk. The person's brain might be able to take that in a little bit more and make sense of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got notes everywhere. And I just remembered I wanted to ask specifically about sugar. I've heard that people with FASD are very vulnerable to sugar addiction. I've heard it said that, because alcohol turns to sugar, the person is more physiologically prone to becoming addicted to sugar. Can you speak on any of that?
I can say that there are some studies that have found that folks with FASD might be more likely to consume higher amounts of sugar. Again, is it like a genetic thing or something in the brain physiologically going on? Maybe in some cases, sure. We know that there's some literature on trauma and sugar. So look at the trauma component. Impulsivity is linked with poor eating habits.
Yeah.
Food insecurity is linked with higher consumptions of processed food. Why? It's cheaper. It's really cheap to go get a soda at the gas station. It tastes good. It may spike their energy up, but they're not connecting the dots now. In 15, 20 minutes, they're so tired, they're anxious, they're dealing with more self-control issues. Modeling behavior is talked about in the literature again. What are your caregivers doing? That is a huge factor. Be aware of what you are doing, what kind of food you're bringing into the environment. And unfortunately, the schools play a huge role. I don't know every school out in the United States, but a lot of schools too, just being aware of how much sugar is in school,
Yeah.
vending machines, lunchtime, things like that. I do a lot of work with adults with FASD. A lot of them live in group homes. And I wrote an article, you can Google this. It was specific to folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities and sugar. And it was written for group home staff. And the research on that really says some group homes, what do they do to reward their clients? We go to the gas station and get some candy or pop. We go to the fast food joint. We have takeout night. We all love that kind of stuff, but they don't realize what they're truly doing to that client's metabolic health, their brain health. So again, modeling has a lot to do with it. Proximity, impulse control. Are there co-occurring factors going on here like depression? If we're dealing with high levels of depression, our serotonin's off, our gut's off, of course, we stress eat. That helps us feel a little bit better. When our sleep is off, we're much more likely to reach for something sugary. I mean, these are just some of the things going on here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so fascinating. So what can parents and caregivers, what can we do to prevent? I know you started listing some of them because clearly diet has a lot to do with it, sleep has to do with it, but what are ways we can prevent or avoid our kiddos especially our kiddos with FASD from kind of heading in that direction of becoming addicted to, dangerous substances?
Look at the family system, what's going on in the family environment. So caregiver modeling, work with a therapist, counselor, skills workers. Food insecurity, tackle that if you can, if you're working with families and they're dealing with food insecurity. I'll give a lot of practical tips that most people probably know about, but I want to give a few tips that maybe you haven't ever considered. Blood sugar dysregulation in the general drug use literature says it might be a major factor for relapse on drugs and alcohol. So blood sugar dysregulation, you skip meals constantly, your blood sugar levels go down and down and down. What happens? For someone that doesn't have a drug or alcohol problem, if you skip meals and your blood sugars become very low, irritability, more moodiness, grogginess, and a lot of times you reach for a candy bar, you go through the drive-through, you drink something really sugary, it gets your blood sugars back up pretty high. Maybe you're feeling great for a little bit, but then it crashes. So anything you do to learn about blood sugar dysregulation, huge factor. There are more and more studies that people are surprised to hear this, but I mean, I'll put a call to action out there. Every drug and alcohol treatment program in the United States and around the world should look at their nutrition, what they're serving. You're going to find a lot of studies that talk about poor dietary practices may continue the habit forming behaviors with drugs and alcohol. So really looking at that can be very helpful. If that client or whoever it is smokes cigarettes, the caffeine, the sugar, tackle those things too. A lot of people think, well, it's not as bad as drugs. It's debatable, but if you already know there's other addictive tendencies there with whatever it is, identify them, start addressing them early on. The alexithymia piece, work with a therapist that can help that child or teenager or adult learn how to name, label, process, and make sense of emotions. That is a very practical strategy that can make a huge difference in helping that person maybe reduce or avoid addictive tendencies. If you look at the general FASD literature, we all know this, but whatever approach you use, make sure it's developmentally, emotionally appropriate to that person's thinking patterns, because most people with FASD function a lot lower than how old they actually are on paper. So making it more concrete, visual, using non-judgmental, non-stigmatizing language. So maybe getting training in motivational interviewing, using strengths-based approaches, trauma-informed approaches, those kind of things. Anytime you're teaching a skill, make it concrete, make it visual, make it very clear, be very mindful of the vocabulary you're using so it's not overwhelming to the individual. Don't multitask. Be aware of what's going on around you. So if you're trying to teach a skill, if there's a lot of background noise, lots of commotion, the brain's already moving around, it's hard to focus. So finding a skills worker who maybe has training in like psychiatric rehabilitative approaches. So you're using like coaching, modeling, teaching, role playing. And if you're teaching a skill in one setting, don't assume the person with FASD has mastered that skill. Teach it in other settings as well. So if you teach it at home, do they know how to use the skill outside of the home? If it's a therapist who the client goes to their office, does that therapist really know they've really grasped the skill? Teach it in multiple settings. Use those holistic approaches, sleep, exercise, nutrition. Those can be very helpful. Be flexible and individualize your approach, because everybody with FASD is so different. Everyone has unique strengths and everyone has unique limitations and experiences. So really tailor it to that person's just functioning level, family background, cultural considerations need to be taken into account, gender factors, age-related factors. Focus on resilience in the entire family system. If that entire family system can build resilience, you're going to be much better at handling stress. Resilience says it's a protective factor against depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use, suicide, anger control problems, sleep issues. Does the family need more support? Maybe they need extra support besides just for the child. I'm a major fan of supporting the whole family. Now, we're always the best interest of the child, but if the parents aren't taken care of and they're burnt out, I've seen this happen so many times that the child goes to some sort of treatment program. They think, let's fix the child, but they go back to a broken home. The whole system. Yeah, you got to look at the whole system, in my opinion. I love lifestyle medicine interventions. There's not any literature on FASD and lifestyle medicine per se, but it's common sense. Lifestyle medicine
Mhm.
focuses on exercise, eating whole food, plant-based diets, getting good sleep, managing stress, avoiding drugs and alcohol, and focusing on positive social connections. I can give more if you'd like, if a couple more, if that's helpful. And
Yeah, I'm writing as fast as I can.
yeah,
I'll
yeah,
have to
yeah,
listen to this podcast over
of
again
course.
myself.
Yeah, of course. In the general substance use literature as it relates to adolescence, it talks about if you want to decrease adolescent substance misuse, focus on parent-child relationships and attachment.
Mm.
So really hone in on parental patterns, warm parenting approaches, attachment-based parenting. We did some, I think we did one on like neural parenting, trauma-informed parenting.
Mhm.
Those would be very helpful. Focusing, it does talk about get connected to a church or spiritual group, different positive support networks. Focus on peer relationships. A lot is going to do with who that person associates with at school.
Mm.
And it does talk about exercise. Get out there and exercise. It's a great way to reduce cravings, reduce impulsivity, depression, anxiety. It really is medicine. But again, like if you're looking at nutrition, exercise, sleep, talk to your healthcare provider first. But those are holistic approaches that can help in so many levels, including reducing the risk of substance misuse.
Yeah, and so many of those things we can focus on those right now, right? We can get out there with
Absolutely.
as a family and go for a walk. We can play a board game or a sport type game and get exercise in and laughs and build connection. Healthy eating, those are all things that we can do. And looking for ways to decrease the stress level, the anxiety that our kids have, which is really secondary to when it comes to FASD, not understanding the child or the kid's primary symptoms, not supporting them well. I mean, I've seen recently with the families that I work with such an increase in problems at school because it's not acknowledged at school that this individual is prenatally exposed, or the school doesn't understand that and they're refusing to provide accommodations because this is an invisible disability, right? So and then the student is just in such a situation where there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, you know, problems everywhere at school, and then turning to vaping, turning to marijuana, turning to substances to cope, when really we need to fix the environment that the student is in, and then there wouldn't be that draw to self-medicate, so to speak. So can you speak to that a little bit? What are some ways, if we're seeing that we have kids that have a lot of anxiety because they're not being well supported, there's not accommodations, what can parents and caregivers do? I know so many of us are just we're advocating for our kids. We're trying to educate everybody in their lives to understand, this is a brain difference. Their brain works differently. They need some help and support. When they don't get that, then there's the stress and the anxiety, and then they maybe, especially our teens, self-medicating. Can you give us some advice there?
If you can hire a consultant who knows these things, who can navigate these bridges, that's an option.
Mm-hmm.
If you're working with psychiatrists, therapists, could they get involved and write letters or consult with the school? Talk to special education professionals at the school, the principals. I mean, if you're running into dead ends constantly, is there an option to switch schools?
Mm.
It does get tricky.
Yeah.
Finding professionals who can maybe write a letter to the school that's very practical, or putting together some educational handouts for teachers. I mean, everyone's so busy nowadays. It's just one more thing for school teachers in their mind. Oh, now I got to learn about this FASD, which I think it should be one of the number one things they should learn about, because it is almost double the rate of autism, even though
Yeah.
most school teachers get a lot of training in autism and ADHD, but it's equally important to understand FASD, because you are interacting with kids probably all the time who have undiagnosed FASD, particularly if you have students with these long list of diagnoses.
Yeah.
be suspicious. So it does get tricky, but finding professionals who can navigate those waters and really speak with confidence. Sometimes schools listen to that as well.
Yeah, I know the school systems are always, so many of us parents are struggling because it doesn't seem that, the school understands. I've just last spring had to have the counselor that works with my son, who is attachment and adoption and FASD informed and highly respected in our region. Um, I had to have her in on an IEP meeting because there was this schools like to consequences, right? That's how they control behavior. They try to manage behavior. And, you know, I know, and, a lot of us know that, people with FASD, consequences don't really work. And in my son's case, it was increasing his anxiety, which was increasing the behavior that the school was trying to control through the consequence. So bringing, I was able to have his counselor in on the speakerphone during an IEP meeting, because I was just, even though I'm a professional in professional air quotes, I'm seen in my, I'm seen in this space as somebody who knows about FASD, but at my kid's school, I'm kind of, just seen as, here's a mom who she doesn't know anything, right? We're the professionals. We know all the things. So bringing in that professional to speak to this and to explain why consequences don't work and that, this kid needs, teaching, practice, reteaching, more practice, not consequences, because the consequence isn't going to change the behavior, right? So then it was like everybody in the room was like, oh, so mom isn't like the crazy mom. But sometimes, we're kind of forced to educate the educators, and sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. And I know a lot of families who've switched to homeschooling because it's a better fit for their kids because there's less, less stimuli in the environment. Like my son doesn't do well with loud, crowded environments where there are a lot of talking and a lot of activity. He can't learn in those environments. He actually does better at home where it's quiet and there's less people, then he can learn. So it's finding those things that are better fits. What's the best fit for the child, for the kid?
Yeah, well stated. And I have heard that too. More and more parents are doing the homeschooling, and pros and cons to everything,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say if a family chooses to do the homeschooling, if the kiddo has an IEP, maintain that. You don't want to, slam the door shut on all of public education. You really need to make sure. My kids have always had their, even when we homeschooled, they had their IEP. They would receive services through the school and testing and whatnot, which is important. Like we want to, we need to use every avenue that's going to help best support our kids.
Fine. Well, I know we covered a lot of
Yeah.
ground today, and we dabbled in a lot of topics. I know we covered in other podcast segments, but hopefully folks can look at those too, because they really build on each other and
Yes.
complement one another. And yeah, is there any other things I can answer today, Sandra?
I was just going to, wrap up with, most of our listeners are adoptive and foster parents. Our kids face so many challenges. So if there's any, words of advice or encouragement that you could leave us with today, we'd greatly appreciate it.
A lot of research out there on these related topics. There's a lot of people that care about these topics, and there's a lot of practical things that you as a caregiver can do right away. And again, to recap, and one thing I didn't say is have consistent mealtime. Kids that have consistent meal times with their
Mhm.
parents are much more likely to have better outcomes. And that is disengaging from the technology too.
Yes, I was
Look
going
at
to
your
say, put down the
technology.
screen.
Yeah. Model good technology habits too. Be aware of, again, your modeling behaviors. Eat healthy, exercise, get good sleep, fix the gut. Those are practical recommendations that I think all households should do. And it can lead to better outcomes on so many levels, including reducing the risk of addictive behavior. Again, working in conjunction with your healthcare team and providers is the way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, such wise advice as always, Jerrod. Thank you so much for educating and equipping us for this challenging parenting journey. always grateful to have you on and looking forward to having you back next month.
Thank you, Sandra. You're welcome. I appreciate you.
Thank you. We appreciate you tons too. Thanks, Jerrod. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey. I hope you found my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown helpful. He is a regular on this podcast. In fact, we recorded over 20 episodes with Dr. Brown throughout 2022 and 2023. He mentioned some of the topics that we covered. We did a whole series called What Every Adoptive and Foster Parent Needs to Know. So you can scroll back through all of our episodes and go back pretty far, but there are dozens of episodes with Dr. Brown where he tackles these topics that are so relevant to the adoption and foster care journey. So I recommend that you do that. They are among our most popular, most downloaded episodes. And you'll want, you really want to get a notebook and designate it Dr. Jerrod Brown and just take notes, because you'll find that sometimes I have to listen. Not only do I get the privilege of having the conversation with him initially, but sometimes I have to go back and re-listen because my notes that I'm scribbling during the conversation, I can't read them because I'm writing so fast and trying to get it all down. But then listening a second time where I can go through and really listen and take notes, because it's just so much wonderful information. He takes us deep in the weeds on so many important topics. So I hope that you will do that. In addition to this podcast, where we have those important conversations, we have other valuable resources for you. Mentioned at the top of the episode, we have the parent coaching. If you have a kiddo with an FASD and you just want to do some one-on-one with me to kind of unpack that, look at the symptoms that your kiddo is exhibiting and how do you accommodate those, how can we support our kids best? It's kind of a personalized version of a training session. And then I do the in-person and online training and workshops. And of course, our Hope for the FASD online support group. We meet 3 times a month via Zoom. We've got families from all over the United States and one from Canada even, who join us for this. It's 90 minutes, 3 times a month. And we stay connected in a private Facebook group where we can put prayer requests, ask questions, leave encouraging messages. And every Saturday in the support group, in the private Facebook group, we do Soul Care Saturday. So myself or my other co-leader of the group, Debbie Raymond, she and I take turns and we do a video devotional that we post every Saturday in that group. So you can get some, really faith-based encouragement as well for this journey. So it's an excellent way to not go it alone, because this is a challenging parenting journey, right? So check out all of those resources. Again, they're on our website, justicefororphans.ny.org. And there's also a link in the show notes to our website where you can find all of those things. Also, be sure to find and follow us on social media. Justice for Orphans is on both Facebook and Instagram, as well as myself, Sandra Flack. You can find me on both platforms. I always love to be connected and hear from our listeners. Send me an email if you would like to cover a specific topic. If you would like to just chat, you have a question, a suggestion, anything. My email is also in the show notes. So if you want to contact me directly, you'll get me directly. If nobody else reads my mail, it's me. So if you want to, or maybe you have a testimony and you want to just share what this podcast has meant to you, love to hear those testimonies as well. So I'm grateful that you spent your valuable time with me today, and I'm thrilled to have you along for the journey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans, and check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.